In the climax of Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, moneylender Shylock draws a knife to collect a legally binding debt, 1 pound of human flesh. But just before the first cut, the judge, Portia, stops him. She rules that while Shylock is entitled to the flesh, the contract mentions no blood. If he spills a single drop, he forfeits his life and his lands. Many legal scholars dismiss this moment as a cheap trick. Prominent jurists like Judge Richard Posner have described the ruling as a hyper-technicality, a semantic game used to bypass a contract. Literary critic Terry Eagleton argued Portia's ruling is a form of pedantry, choosing to follow the narrowest interpretation of a text rather than its meaning. Both the legal and literary worlds generally view this courtroom victory as a flimsy civil loophole, a plot device used to save the protagonist at the last second. But treating this scene as a secular technicality ignores its specific internal logic. There is a rigid theological structure beneath the surface that makes this ruling inevitable. Portia is not actually relying on Venetian civil code. She is constructing a legal trap built out of Jewish Pentateuchal law. She uses this framework to force Shylock into a theological mirror, holding him accountable to the strictest laws of his own faith. Recognizing this framework reveals how 16th century legal debates were inextricably bound to specific verses in the Hebrew Bible. To find the trap, we first have to establish the baseline legal reality of the time, 16th century English common law. In a real 16th century court, Shylock's contract would be voided immediately. Under common law, any deed that emboldens a man to commit a crime, like physical assault, is legally unenforceable. Furthermore, even a valid bond would only result in a judgment for monetary damages. A judge would never order the specific performance of a physical mutilation.
Yet, in this fictional Venice, the court allows the specific performance of bodily harm. It treats the collection of flesh as a valid and mandatory civil remedy. This creates an absurdity. Portia threatens Shylock with the total confiscation of his assets for simply spilling blood while he is attempting to execute a court-sanctioned contract. Because secular civil law cannot explain these extreme penalties, we must look for the different legal code that Portia is using to judge the lender. In the 16th century, the morality of charging interest, or usury, was a subject of constant theological debate. These debates typically focused on the Hebrew Bible, specifically the prohibitions against oppression found in Exodus 22. The specific Hebrew word used for usury is neshek. The literal translation of neshek into English is the verb to. Renaissance commentators, such as Bishop John Jewell, frequently explain this by saying a usurer bites the debtor, eventually consuming their whole substance. Shylock is a usurer who is demanding a literal pound of flesh. He is the etymological definition of his trade made physical. Within this framework, collecting collateral is not just a financial exchange. It is prosecuted as the literal act of consuming human flesh. Once the court treats the collection of debt as the consumption of meat, it invokes the dietary laws found in Genesis 9 and Leviticus 17. These texts permit the eating of flesh, but they impose a strict, absolute prohibition on the consumption of blood. The Pentateuchal penalty for consuming blood with the meat is being cut off from the community. Portia's ruling is a weaponized dietary restriction. Shylock is ordered to collect his debt without blood, and when he cannot, he suffers the biblical penalty. He is forced to convert and is cut off from his community and his wealth. Portia adds a second decree. Shylock must take exactly 1 pound of flesh, not a fraction more and not a fraction less. If the scale turns by even the weight of a hair, she declares that Shylock will be put to death. This logic comes from Deuteronomy 25, which demands perfect and just weights and warns of the consequences of even slight inexactness. In the verses immediately following this law, the Bible connects the use of false weights to the unrighteous enemy known as Amalek. The text commands the Jews to put out the remembrance of Amalek from under heaven, a mandate for total destruction that Portia mirrors with her sudden threat of the death penalty. The exact weight demand functions as a theological trap, casting Shylock as the archetypal enemy of righteousness defined in the text of Deuteronomy. We have to place this trial in its historical context, the Venetian ghetto, established in 1516. Jewish residents were legally barred from the city's guilds and prohibited from owning property. They were physically confined to these isolated islands. This segregation forced the population into a few narrow trades, like usury, which the city then heavily stigmatized.
Shylock's insistence on his bond was a reaction to this structural economic isolation, which makes his eventual defeat in court more than a simple victory for justice. Portia's presence in the courtroom shifts the proceedings away from secular civil code, aligning her role with that of an Old Testament prophet. By trapping Shylock within his own theological laws, Portia reveals the performative nature of her mercy. Her speech is not a plea for his benefit, but a test he is destined to fail. The forced religious conversion and the total forfeiture of his assets serve as a display of state power, rather than a balanced legal compromise. This scene captures a collision of ancient theology, linguistic metaphor, and systemic power, all working through the medium of a trial. The play suggests that the law in this context is not an objective set of rules, but a subjective arena where the dominant culture interprets and enforces the code. Ultimately, justice without genuine mercy functions merely as a legally sanctioned method of social domination.